Chapter 8 The Wizard's Story 35. There will be time for questions and lengthy explanations and all the thank yous and other such nonsense that needs to be said soon enough, Dedlin Dane snapped irritably, shaking moths from his hat and handing out hand towels. He was wet, angry, and anxious to get moving on now that everyone was out of danger and accounted for. He glared across the fold at the Garnian scouts hovering in the trees, and he frowned. First of all, we've got to get rid of them. We lost most our packs, Jameson said, feeling somewhat like a drowned rat. Gabriel handed him another hand towel to dry himself off with. You've lost more than your packs, I'd say. Since I saw you last, you lost a perfectly fine fighter craft to a creeper that's been living in the same hill for 150 years, wasted at least 3 days walking in the wrong blessed direction, and nearly drowned in the rising floodwaters of Arrowgreen. You now have 4 Garnian ships escorting you across the country, with more on the way, no doubt, and you lost your packs. That probably doesn't cover it. You didn't happen to offend any wood elves along the way, did you? Never mind, I don't want to know. The troop looked sickly at one another. Well, I hope not, Dedlin said. Anyway, fear not, I brought ample food and some extra clothes, although I wouldn't hope that everything is going to fit that well. So hang your soggy stuff on a line to dry, and I have much to tell you later. He leaned over to Gabriel with a concerned and inquisitive eye. He whispered, and how is the, you're in charge of its safety. Feeling suddenly flushed, Gabriel felt for the chain around his neck. Thank goodness the key was still on it. Fine, Dedlin, he stuttered. What a disaster that could have been. We're fine. Well, good. All's not lost then, despite everyone's best efforts. Stardeer is just ahead of us here among the rocks. I expect no one's against air travel this evening, then? No, they mumbled. Good, let's get on board, then. I've brought along 2 more crew members who are new to the Wildlands. Before anyone could respond, he went on. Lake Tobias and Cran Methylard, whom you might remember as the same 2 Tungulan Castle Rangers. They've recently joined the voluntary Knights of Galgaraya, and since they were in attendance at the Secret Council and heard much of what was going on, I agreed with their request to come along with us. We could use an extra pair of hands or 2. They will be acting as your pages on this journey, but don't be too hard on them. They're nervous enough about all this as it is. I'll trust you to bring them all up to speed thus far. Now listen up. We'll need to travel through the night now to make up for lost time. I suspect the possibility that we've been discovered by the enemy and that bigger warships will soon be on the way. If so, things are going to be getting very, very dangerous before long. So let's start preparing for it. It's time to start thinking for a change. He groused at them like a grumpy old man. It's good to see you too, Dreher Freygood ventured to say. He pulled another straggling moth from his ear. What took you so long, anyway? Dedlin snorted at the question and continued marching crossly up the hill. Let's go find that damn magical cave. No one knew much about what that truly meant, except the soggy boy. 36. Within the hour, Stardeer was sailing swiftly through the summer evening sky, with the eagle-eyed and cantankerous Dedlin Dane at the helm of his own skycraft, leaving the valley of Arrowgreen far behind them. King Jameson had changed into loose, dry clothes and had joined the wizard at the helm. Dreher, Percy, and Ott were then below, trying to get an early sleep so that they could take the long night shift later. Binder was still cleaning up, and Gabriel was introducing himself to Lake and Cran near the starboard rail. The 2 castle rangers stared at the Bersian prince warrior with eyes as wide as coins, engaging with him in nervous conversation as best they could. Jameson studied the old man briefly. The wizard looked a decade younger than he had back in Tungulan to him, There was some color in his sallow cheeks and some sun's color on his skin. His hair and beard were now braided, pulled back and tied, much more practical for skycraft flight. His dark eyes were sharp and bright beneath the shadow of his bushy gray eyebrows. "You don't know how glad I am to see you," Jameson said to the wizard. "I feared that you were dead." "I do have some idea how glad you are," Devlin replied with a wry smile. "I am sorry, but I was tied up with other matters. You'll hear about my recent escapades soon enough. But in the meanwhile, how is our little secret? Is it still safe?" Jameson shook his head, knowing specifically which personal secret the wizard was referring to, something no one else there yet knew. "Yes," he answered, "still secret, as far as I know." "That's amazing," Devlin replied quietly. "Not even Gabriel suspects?" "I don't think so. Maybe," Jameson said. "I suppose I could tell him?" "Well, no need to rush. You will when you're ready. It's served your purposes well enough so far. Very strategic." A moment of comfortable silence passed between them. "Did the wizards at the council know too?" he asked. "I was very nervous." "Oh yes, they knew. That was the reason they hesitated before confirming your true identity. I had to explain things to them later to better help them, help them better understand the purpose of your secret. They found the entire premise exceptionally delightful." "I'm glad. But it does bring up other questions," Devlin said more grimly. "Shh, we have company. We'll talk about this later." Gabriel walked across the deck and joined them there. "Good evening," he said. "The fellowship is all together again." As it should be," the wizard replied with a wink. "Devlin, I just wanted to say that I feel responsible for the mishaps we've encountered over the last few days," the prince then said. "My responsibilities. I was in charge in your stead and I failed on several counts. I hope that your faith in me hasn't wavered irreparably." Don't be so hard on yourself, young prince. Not at all. No rack and ruin." He leisurely banked Stardeer around a cluster of oak trees, then leveled off again, maintaining the ship less than 20 feet above the scrubby greensward terrain of scattered bogs steaming below. "To be honest, things might have turned out much worse had those mishaps not occurred," he then said, now that this senile grumpiness had subsided. "In fact, they turned out to be blessings in disguise." How so?" Gabriel was inclined to ask. "Well, most importantly, firstly, by being delayed by the creeper, there's a good chance that you escape capture. The day after the creeper took Percy's skycraft, a fleet of Garnian warships was reported to be crossing your intended flight path. That old wretched creeper just might have saved your lives. And this mission. By the gods, when I heard the report of the enclosing Garnian fleet, I flew like a gale wind. I was very encouraged when I found the crumpled hull of Sunshaft and none of your gnawed bones strewn around the creeper's den. I shouted with joy, the wizard said. Then he was inclined to apologize. I was a bit too rough on everyone earlier this evening. I was just cross and wet and tired and fearful back there at Arrow Green. You were heading in the right approximate direction for those 3 days on foot. Generally. As best you could. Jameson glanced over his shoulder at the 4 specks on the horizon following behind as if tethered on lines to the back of the ship. Don't worry about them, the wizard then said with a devilish light in his eye. I have an evasion plan. Well, I'm anxious to hear, Gabriel said. Tonight was all he would say about that. Tonight we will lose them. In the meantime, I've made a nice dark roasted coffee beans in the pantry that should just about be ready. Please have some and share it with the rest of the crew. But don't drink too much. It'll make you as jittery as dragonflies. 37. Novices Lake and Cran had been given the charge as lookouts that evening and stood as honored and devoted sentinels on the front and back of Devlin's skycraft. The remaining 6 were below, getting much needed and well-deserved rest. Devlin alone remained at the helm, keeping Stardeer at full speed through the twilight and into the coming night, steering a straight arrow course toward the southeast for many ongoing hours. But, try as he might to outrun them, his ship was no equal to the Garnian's sleek crafts tailing along behind. A very mild midnight sunrise came and went, and now the moonless night was as pitch as coal. It was nearly time for a shift change at the helm, but before he relieved himself from duty, Devlin began to make preparations to lose the Garnians once and for all before he himself retired for the night, as he had promised. 3 of the Garnian scout ships were smaller than Devlin's Stardeer, but one fighter was thrice its size. All 4 of them loomed much closer now that night was upon them, most likely keeping Devlin's ship under surveillance with high-powered night scans. Sometimes Devlin spotted red beacon lights on their bellies, and occasionally a spotlight would come on, aimed in one direction or another, but most of the time the Garnian ships flew without lights, in sheer and utter darkness. Devlin strapped himself into the helmsman's chair and took a deep breath. It was time. Lake, Cran, hold on to something, my good fellows, he forewarned the other 2 atop. It's going to be a wild one for a bit. They hurriedly did as he suggested, and no sooner had they snapped the safety latches on their seat harnesses, they heard him mutter to himself, I feel as though I'm forgetting something. Anyway, here goes. He shut off all the lights on his skycraft. Without slowing, he jerked the steering bar hard to the right, spinning Stardeer directly around in a half circle, now facing the oncoming Garnian ships, firing no less than 10 missiles in rapid succession straight back at them. At the same time, he flipped a switch that caused Stardeer's levitation vents to open. It released the inert gases that kept her afloat, and she began falling like a rock backwards into the thick forest trees. From throughout the craft, Devlin heard frenzied voices. He realized then what he had forgotten, to forewarn the rest of the crew to strap themselves in. I knew I'd forgotten something. The missiles had missed the Garnians, but that was of no concern to the wizard. That wasn't the purpose. They had hit the trees and the forest all around them, lighting the night with bright orange fireballs, intending for a distraction. That should blind them for a while, night scans or no, he said aloud to himself. He quickly flipped the switch again, closing off the gas vents, and the powerful turbines quickly filled the tanks again. He leveled Stardeer off, still crashing backwards down through the treetops, pushing the accelerator bar back forward with all his might. The ship slowed and slid to a complete stop with a hissing, swishing roar of air, just as several Garnian missiles flew past overhead, exploding in the trees behind him. Everyone and everything on board tumbled and rolled toward the back of the ship, and once again frantic voices cried out below. "Sorry," he said. A few seconds later, with Stardeer descending slowly down under the dense cover of the trees like a cautious fish sinking slowly out of sight in a dark, deep lake, they headed back the way they had just come. The Garnians flew swiftly past them overhead, all searchlights now ablaze, firing wildly into the far distance in frustrated retaliation. Immediately, the wizard turned 90 degrees to the north and began creeping along at a ridiculously slow snail's pace, still descending lower and lower into the ancient forest boughs in complete blindness. He lit his console with a faint blue luminescent glow that was undetectable from more than even a few feet away. By now, everyone below was scrambling up onto the deck, clinging onto whatever they could for dear life. Percy raced to the helm. "Did we crash?" he cried. "Devlin, is everyone okay?" "Are we hit?" Binder called. "Shh," the wizard simply told him. "Good night, good friends," he said quietly, heading below for a long-needed rest. Someone take over, if you please. Stardeer is now yours. We are free of the Garnian fleas and ticks, so go north until dawn, east until breakfast, then south until lunch. See you then, if not sooner." Good night," Jameson said to him. "I have much to tell you in the morning," he replied as he disappeared beneath the awning. "Before wagging, my tongue needs a good rest." The crew watched him retire below. Then they looked around at one another, puzzled and still completely stunned. Where in the world were they? It was pitch black. The foliage that brushed past them was thick and wet. The air was cool and the insects were far too loud. Stardeer squeezed past a thick and ungiving tree trunk and then some heavy limbs, causing the ship to scrape and tilt just to wedge through. Strange noises surrounded them, birds, bugs, and many unnameable tree creatures who did not like being disturbed. They were immersed somewhere deep within some primordial jungle, and there was an unexplainable, creepy feeling all around them. "That wizard is out of his ever-loving mind," Binder mumbled. "Where in the hell are we?" Quinn had not yet opened his eyes or released the rail. His arms were locked solidly around it. There was a small branch protruding from his hat. He was whispering a prayer that he remembered recanting as a child. "I don't know," Jameson said, "but I'm going back below to try to get back to sleep. If I can. I doubt I'll be able to close my eyes anytime soon after that jolt." Suddenly, blinding spotlights pierced the trees from above, grazing past them on the right. The crew instinctively took cover. As the Garnians frantically scanned, the searchlights trickling down through the leaves and roving circles caused strange shadows to dance all around them in the forest depths. "They're searching for us," Gabriel whispered, smiling out of the side of his mouth. "The old coot escaped from them after all." "Well, he said he would," King Day replied, smiling. They knew that the smaller Garnian scout ships would have no trouble following Stardeer beneath the woodland terraces if they knew where to look, but the dark fighter ship above them was much too large to enter the trees. It slowly moved off in the direction of another spotlight that had just come out somewhere to the south, where a golden blaze of kindled trees, ignited from the missile fire, had begun to spread along a short line of dead cedar trees. "Good night," Jameson whispered as he crept below just after the old wizard. "Night," the rest quietly replied. They were still rattled and remained in a mild and somewhat jubilant state of shock nonetheless. "Ingenious," Binder said beneath his breath. He watched the Garnian searchlights fade off into the distance. "But don't tell him I said so." Dreher Freygood smiled to himself. Yes, he certainly can be. 38. Devlin came back up on deck a few hours before dawn, rubbing his puffy eyes. He had been dreaming again, the same uneasy dream that kept haunting him night after night as of late. He was always fleeing from something that was trailing him, something fell and evil, as dark as midnight shadow and as cruel as death, but he could not see what it was, for it kept no earthly shape. It was always coming from behind him, always on the move, sniffing, hunting, searching hungrily. It was smart, horrible, and existed nearly in the ethereal spirit world. It acted without remorse, and Devlin feared that he held no power over this thing. This recurring nightmare had frightened him from his sleep on several occasions, as it had again this night. He began thinking that it wasn't a nightmare at all, but instead a premonition, a vision of something that was soon to come. He vowed to himself not to speak of it to anyone yet, not until he had to. There was no need to frighten them any further, but he knew something evil was on its way, and this crew would inevitably have to face it. He took a deep breath to help him calm his nerves, figuring he could use some medicinal herb smoke. Outside, it was serenely quiet, except for some strange nocturnal waterfowl that cried eerily from some dark river beneath the trees to the west. Percy was back at the helm. Ott was standing statuesquely close by on the watch, his keen feline eyes gleaming gold in the dark. Stardeer had gotten stuck 3 or 4 times through the night as she had coasted diligently along, and Percy had just backed her up and found another way through again. At this juncture, it was smooth sailing through the widened middle terraces, and they were enjoying a relatively good speed. The wizard glanced up at the sky through the levels of gloomy leaves, yawning as he stretched. "Ready to get on out of here?" he said, reaching for the onboard light switch. Ott seized the wizard's hand, startling him. Percy directed the wizard's attention to the southern skies. There, past the dark silhouettes of the trees, was a large black space in the heavens where the stars could not shine through. Devlin realized then that it was a Garnian warship, a large megahull warship more than 100 times larger than Stardeer, hovering silently above the forest with its lights off, watching and waiting and hoping that the crew of Stardeer would do something careless to reveal her position. The large ships had arrived. Even the tiniest glimmer of light would now be detected from above. Devlin whispered, "Like I said earlier, I'll see you gentlemen in the morning, and I'll try to leave my overconfidence with my humility under my pillow from now on where it belongs." "Rest well," Percy said. The last thing they heard him say before his head disappeared through the deck portal was, "I miss my cat." 39. A gold and crimson sunrise foretold of more rain to come later that morning. A stoic Commander Binder had relieved Master Pilot Percy, taking control of the helm of Stardeer shortly after they had risen from the sweltering jungle canopies. The ship was still covered with debris from the forest. Leaves, sticks, seeds, insects, a knotted tree snake, and a strange little brown animal resembling a lemur or a sloth, which they caught and released without incident. The crew busied themselves by tidying things up on the ship. Binder flew low, once again at full throttle, heading directly south, following a ridge of hills that rose like the lumpy spine of some great animal. Dreer had risen early and was working on breakfast for everyone. Lake and Quan were setting plates and spoons, filling mugs, washing cookware, and wiping countertops. Despite the cramped quarters, the crew was in good spirits because, thanks to Devlin's ingenious scheme, they had successfully eluded the Garnian scout ship tagalongs once and for all. The trees were thinning out below them, now clumped together in sparse patches between the rolling hills and mossy tundra. The grass of the oncoming plains was as resplendent green, dotted with wildflowers in the vivid colors of summer: bright gold, ivory white, black, yellow, orange, and lavender. The ship would soon pass the rough outskirts bordering the far west reaches of Galgaraya and enter the vast rolling treeless plains of Tush. Jameson came to an aromatic table of fried ham and fresh baked bread. He was the last to eat, but had 2 portions of eggs, ham, and toast, and topped off his meal with a glass of cold, sour Rama's milk, a welcome treat. He cleaned his own utensils and whisked the crumbs off of the small, cube-shaped wooden box that he had been using as a seat. The box, he noticed after closer inspection, was strange in its design. It was apparently carved out of some kind of hardwood, but it was as light as a feather. It looked very old, and its surface was covered with hand carvings of the moons and of trees and large, elegant waterfowl. On another side of it, there was a rippling ocean with a score of large, flat-bottomed boats, sails full of wind. The box appeared to have no seams, nor nails or screws holding it together, as if it had been carved from a solid block of wood, although by its weight it appeared to be hollow inside. As Jameson continued to turn it, images changed, disappeared, and then reappeared again elsewhere upon its surface, as if telling a story? "What is this?" he asked, intrigued. "Oh, careful with that, Your Highness," Dedlin replied, coming up from the lower deck with an old crumpled map in his hands. "It's a box made by the wizard Jaws in the King Tolfway. You may examine it and be amazed, but do be careful. It can be dangerous." Dangerous? Yes. Joss was a box maker, you see. Not just any boxes. He was the master of designing and constructing passage boxes, such as the one you're holding. They are strange items with magic that I, myself, have never even fully understood. I brought it along because you never know. It may come in handy in emergency. "Passage boxes," Jameson repeated. He found a button latch and pressed it. A seam formed and the lid popped open. Inside, it was empty. "It's so lightweight, I thought it must have been filled with algae stone gas." Dedlin was shaking his head no. "Alas, no need. The trees of fascination from which this wood was crafted no longer exists on this continent or any other anymore, I fear. Barone trees they were called, and they were rare even in the elder days, growing along the coasts of Tolfway in ancient Nordia when the environment and atmosphere was perfect for them. Sadly, the trees began dying out there, out of loneliness, some used to claim, despite the efforts and kindness of the Mahekian caregivers who tried to preserve their kind. Jaws took the wood from the trees just before they passed to construct the most wondrous items from them. See, the wood of a young, thriving Barone tree, or from one already dead, held no power at all. Only the wood taken from the one taken just before its passing could be used for all sorts of wizards' manipulations. It was lightweight and strong, unlike any other, as you can most probably see. The box is magic, then? True magic is only achieved by the complete understanding of physical laws of nature, he explained like a professor, so that ways may be found to bend or break them without interrupting the natural flow of anything and everything else. This passage box by Jaws is a perfect example of that theoretical definition of magic. Well, it looks perfectly normal to me. What is perfectly normal? The wizard explained. I don't really understand what you mean. All magic is normal and natural, so to say, he went on more scholarly. Magic is nothing but precise scientific formulas that alter existing laws of nature, of gravity, thought, energy, motion, sight, light, and sound, fire, animals, and so on and so forth. There are natural functions happening all around us at all times. Wizards learn how to cause these laws to malfunction, fluctuate, and or alter, while controlling them through exact calculation, experimentation, manipulation, and faith. Proper incantations. Magic can be very simple, he said, opening his hand, palm up, with a ball of fire appearing to float and roll just above it, like a miniature orbiting sun. Or it can be very complicated. The ball of fire exploded, startling everyone who was watching. The sparks turned into tiny blue butterflies flying away in all directions. Jameson giggled. Amazing, Dedlin. Can you do other magic too? Well, I began learning levitation, or the undoing of gravity, when I was about, half your age. That was my favorite. Then I worked my way up from there. Jameson spun the box, opposite corners in his palms. You said to be careful, he said. Why, Devlin? What does a passage box do? Well, several things. Most importantly, it teaches. Start by putting your hand in the box, he said, clearing his throat. Your Highness. Curiously, Jameson did as Devlin suggested. He did not know what to expect, so he did this slowly. Further, Devlin encouraged with a smile. Jameson did as he said, further and further. There's no bottom, he finally sputtered in awe. He put his entire arm inside, all the way up to his shoulder, and although on the outside the passage box was only 3/4 of the length of his arm, Jameson's fingertips could not find the bottom or the sides of it on the inside in any direction. How far does it go? He asked excitedly. No further than the opposite end of the box, Devlin answered, smiling at him. So, Jameson said, searching for a logical explanation. Actually, my arm shrinks when it goes inside the box? See for yourself, the wizard encouraged. See for yourself, look. Jameson peered into Devlin's box and shook his head in fascinated wonder. My whole arm is right there as normal as can be, but is nowhere near the bottom of the box. The space inside the passage box is different from the space out here. That is correct, Your Highness, Devlin said, looking pleased. Good, you figured it out. There is nearly a square mile in this particular box. Works wonders for storage, sometimes. Commander Binder had been watching and listening to this instruction, but he shook his head in disbelief. A square mile, he mumbled. That's ridiculous, old man. Jameson held it up to him. Try it yourself, Commander Binder. Binder took the passage box with a smirk on his face, wanting to expose the trick. There's not a square mile inside this box, he said, holding the open side of it up to his face. That's just preposterous. He then reached his own massive arm inside of it to tap the box bottom with his fingertips, but he could not do it, experiencing the same remarkable phenomenon that Jameson Day had. He stretched his entire arm inside, up to his shoulder, and looking in, the bottom was still far, far away. Don't fall in, Binder, Devlin warned. It's a long way to the bottom if leveled off in that direction. Binder set the box down beside him with the opening facing upward toward the sky. You're hypnotizing us, or using some other sort of wizard's trick, he groaned. A square mile indeed, silliest thing I've ever heard. Watch this, Jameson said. He dropped an apple into the top of the box, watching it falling inside. Everyone crowded around to watch. The apple dropped farther and farther away, falling until they could hardly see it. Then Jameson grasped the box and flipped it over, holding it out before him. A few seconds later, the apple fell out and hit the deck at their feet, splattering in all directions as if it had been dropped a mile from the sky. Everyone cheered, except for Commander Binder, of course. 40. The day continued on, racing parallel to the long, lone line of knotty hills. After poring over maps and charts, mumbling and measuring, Devlin finally called a meeting to any who wanted to hear his story. Okay, time for explanations and answers. Time for revelations and some honesty for a change, he said, marching through them. Time for planning and some intelligent preparation. He pulled a wooden pipe from a small cabinet. Most importantly of all, time for a good smoke of Tungulin's best Lambeau pipeweed. It's been far too long since I've had a decent smoke, and my head could use some unclouding this morning. Let's see if I can get this lit with all this confounded wind. Devlin found a spot next to Master Pilot Percy at the covered front helm, and the rest of the crew gathered around them on the 4 curved stairs that rose from the lower deck up along both sides of the helm. Lake and Quan stood quietly behind the rest of them, watching the horizons for unfriendlies as they had been instructed to do. Off the port bow, the sky turned a deep grayish purple. Heavy, threatening clouds billowed, and a new wind blew from that direction. Distant thunder rumbled, and bolts of stark lightning lit the sky and earth beneath. It was going to be the kind of storm one strove to avoid. Drawing closer to Tuss, Drear Freygood surmised about the inclement weather on the horizon. A trail of Lambeau smoke left the wizard's mouth and dissipated in the passing wind. His expression showed that he savored it. "So, Gabriel," he began, coming back into focus. "How was your leg then, son?" "Fine." Denlin's eyes sharpened. "The truth, Prince." "Better," he said more specifically. "I wouldn't win a foot race if I had to, but it's getting better. That long countryside hike was not good for it." "And how are you, your highness?" he asked the young king who stood next to Master Pilot Percy. "Good," the boy said. "Great, now that you've decided to become involved in this quest with us." "Well, I have much to tell you," he replied, turning first to request a drink from the castle rangers. "Quan be a good lad and pour an old man a vessel of ale to keep his whistle wet." "Make that 2, if you please," added Drear Freygood, lighting up his own pipe as well. They were the 2 elderly gentlemen on board. Dedlin went on, satiated. "We're making good time now, and it is time that everyone knew the truth about our mission, where we are going, what we are doing, what it is we seek, and who our enemy is. However, if you will allow beforehand, first it will be my own storyline. I'll take the time to tell you about the night I was nearly devoured by kettle wolves, and who it was who flew to Tugulin in the Tigra that fateful night." You know who it was?" Binder beckoned abruptly for a quick answer on that topic. "I do. However, let me first explain how I was captured by the Garnians, and how I then destroyed the 2 Garnian warships, the Godstrike 5 and the Mount of Steel, single-handedly, right on Tungulin's doorstep, and how I barely escaped with my life. And permit me, if you will, to tell you why I changed King Tytel Bantu into a miniature green aardvark and threw him into the royal fountain." We're going to pause right there, and we'll come back for part 2 of the wizard story tomorrow.